Hello and welcome to the World Economic Forum in Davos in Switzerland. We have a wonderful panel today and a wonderful discussion where we look at some of the most relevant issues which have affected emerging market economies around the world in 2018, leading right into this year. We're talking about protectionist tendencies in the United States and the impact that they have had on emerging markets. The story has been different for different countries, but the International Monetary Fund has also indicated that some of the tensions which now exist between the United States and, for example, China, could in fact have an impact on other countries as well. Is this the case? Should we look at emerging market economies from a short-term basis, or is there a sense that these emerging market economies can return to the rate of development, the pace of development that we have seen in the past? Those are some of the broad issues that we'll be looking at today. And we have a wonderful panel today. To my left, Carrie Lam, the Chief Executive of Hong Kong. Thanks very much for being with us. To her left, Berat Albayrak, the Minister of Finance in Turkey. Tariq Sultan Al Essa is the CEO of Agility. He brings in more of a corporate voice, somebody who can share a non-policy perspective as well on this forum. Kamal Nath is the Chief Minister of one of India's largest states, Madhya Pradesh. He's just become Chief Minister. In fact, the state is among the largest states anywhere in the world. Guido Sandelis is the Governor of the Central Bank of Argentina. Thank you, sir, very much for being with us. And Kevin Schneider, the Global Managing Partner of McKinsey, with us as well. Kevin, let me come to you first. The fact that the US has seen rate hikes several times last year, the fact that we've seen this huge tension between China and the United States on the economic front, the fact that the peace the two appear to have made could be interpreted as being a temporary one at this stage. With this being the overall context of the emerging market scenario, what is your outlook for 2019?
Well, my outlook for 2019 is that the trade dispute itself, of which we have 36 days left of the 90 days set up, is but one facet of a broader tension between China and the United States. And therefore, I think we should not be surprised if the trade issue itself gets resolved, but we still have the underlying questions. And the underlying questions, let's recall, are not just economic. It's the technology and how technology is going to play through. It is global leadership and who ultimately is going to prevail in this world where the United States has changed course. And so when you look at this context, my outlook for 2019 is actually the underlying economics. Not bad at all. When I asked chief executives in Davos, how are you feeling about your business? The answer, pretty good. But they then very quickly say, but I'm very worried about everybody else's business.
Right.
And I think that reflects the tension that's out there, the sense that there are things in the geopolitical environment that as a chief executive you don't control. And that's going to persist. And that means as you look third quarter, fourth quarter, you get a bit more nervous.
Yeah.
My sense, underlying economics are solid, but questions remain, and that's clouding all this debate that we're having here in Davos.
Right. It's an interesting point that you mentioned that, when we look at the US-India, I beg your pardon, the US-China scenario, it's not necessarily linked only to economics. There are other factors as well. And Carrie Lam, I wanted to ask you that question. There is a challenge of global leadership, which this is all about. There is incredible tension, for example, in the South China Sea. And then, of course, there is the trade scenario between China and the United States. Going forward, how are some of these other factors, these other tensions between China and the United States likely to impact the economic scenario between these two countries?
Well, good morning. First of all, Hong Kong, strictly speaking, is not an emerging economy. Okay? We are a pretty mature economy. But the fact that we are so externally oriented and being one of the strongest supporters of free trade does mean that we will be affected by all these externalities, especially US-China relationship. Before I answer your question, I just echo what Kevin said. What we are seeing, perhaps it's not just a temporary phenomenon of buying less, selling less, or buying more, selling more. It's perhaps more fundamental question of whether we still stick to that rule-based multilateral free trade system. If we are not, and we are going to shake up this system, then I'm afraid we are seeing more issues and more tensions that could not be resolved by trade
Is that a
tariff
concern
alone.
for you, that we are seeing a threat to that? The rule-based system is being challenged?
I certainly see that, and I'm quite worried about that because, as I mentioned, we are founding member of World Trade Organization. We prosper over the years on the basis of free and open trade. But if that is no longer the mainstream and certain economies are sort of running away from the rule-based system, that we could be in trouble. But coming back to Hong Kong's economy, although I said we are not an emerging economy, but we love to work with emerging economies because we are very externally oriented. So on this panel, we have Afghanistan, India, and Turkey. And we love to work with all these economies, especially in the Asian region.
Yes.
I'm sure there's no doubt that Asia is now really growing fast and it's going to be the driving engine for economic growth.
So you're positive. Bottom line is you're positive despite the challenges. All right. Mr. Albayrak, as somebody who deals with the state of finances in Turkey, as the head of the bank in Turkey itself, it's been a very difficult year as far as your equation with the United States is concerned. There was a tweet from Donald Trump where he said that he would, and I quote, devastate Turkey economically if Ankara decides to attack Kurdish groups in Syria. Now, the United States has been a close partner for you in the past. That relationship has been changing over a period of time. When you are confronted by rhetoric like this, and you are trying to make Turkey's economy even stronger, what are your big concerns?
I mean, this is very much appreciated for everyone, how Turkey respond back, all these kind of regional, global problems, not this one, in the recent last 10, 15 years, because we are talking about a region where one of the most important, in case of not energy reserves, almost 2/3 of the global oil and gas reserves around that. Like 4 hours of air flight, 1/3 of the global population and GDP was around. Turkey's became one and only, maybe, stable country in the region, if you're talking about it, including all these problems in Iraq, what has happened in Syria, whatsoever. And all these problems has taught us a very significant lesson, how to survive on a struggling environment, in a very challenging environment, in a very strong way. So this one, what you have mentioned about comparing to the August, what we have seen so far, the recent tweet that you have mentioned, how market reacted was a good one, I think. No problematic.
Really react, yes.
Yeah. The thing is, if you're talking about the relationship with countries and economies, this is not something related with daily emotional approaches or sayings or tweets whatsoever, because decades of hundreds of years of, or centuries of old of relationship with countries is more crucial than ever in any aspect. And Turkey, United States have a very strategic and significant cooperation within that sense, in the region and the global arena as well. So the thing is, the following that tweet, that day, we have a very fruitful meeting with Mr. Trump as well. So the thing is, what is very much important in that sense, how Turkey reshaped its economy is very much important, because Turkey has achieved a lot in the last 16 years. This is why I'm saying we are not talking about not only Iraq, but also Syria, millions of refugees all around that region, at least 4 million of them in Turkey.
Yeah.
So Turkey has switched to a new system this June. After 16 years of very strong standing executional success story, we have switched to a very executional-wise, result-oriented system, presidential system. This is why we have reacted this August and September problem, this kind of currency and all these issues, very quickly and strongly.
Yes.
And this is why we ended up in the last 4 months, Turkish lira appreciated almost 25%.
So let me ask you this. In the case of some other emerging economies, for example, Argentina, there has been an involvement of the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, coming in with large loans. Turkey has thus far chosen to follow your own path,
Yes.
to follow your own policies. But the critics of that would say that there is no hard stop. If you don't perform, there is no backup to protect and to revive your economy. What are some of your concerns to that end? Do you think you'll be able to revive your economy successfully without IMF intervention?
That's a good question. I have a saying that if I need to jump to the water, I need to see the in-depthness, So I need to look at the, balance sheet of Turkey to answer this question. In case of the public balance sheet, household balance sheet, financial and non-financial portfolio of it. When you look at the public debt of Turkey is around 28%, which the EM average is 49%, and the global average is 70-80%. Turkey is very low on that one. What about household? Household is around 16%. EM average is 36%. The global average is 60-70%, which means that Turkey is one of the lowest debt levels in that sense as well. When all in all, the whole package, if we put all the Turkish balance sheet debt portfolio, we reached around banking, non-banking, whatsoever, all package, 138%.
Right.
EM average is 211%. Global average is 318%. Turkey is a very strong balance sheet in case of the government performance, household performance. Why? Because I named that. Comparing to summer 2017 to summer 2018, there's almost 100% depreciation of the Turkish lira, but you couldn't see any single person on the street.
No.
Why? Because Turkish household, no lending.
Right.
And even they have this lending, no currency.
Okay.
Foreign currency. So Turkish balance sheet and Turkish state-wise, company-wise, household-wise have a very strong debt management strategy in the last 16 years. If it doesn't kill you, makes you stronger. 2001, 2008, Turkish economy has expanded its immune system within approaching all these problems if you live in such a region, and you need to adapt itself, not for the government perspective, but the private companies as well.
I take your point, but statements from the US leadership have been problematic. I've noticed that in many cases, Turkey's ignored that. But I'll come back to that in a while from now. Mr. Kamal Nath, you've had a very long career as a political leader. You've been a commerce minister in the past. You're a chief minister now. You've just won the elections. Now, if you look at the India story, the IMF just day before yesterday said in their outlook that India is projected to grow at 7.5%, and that's very positive, perhaps better than any of the other emerging economies. Now, in that environment, the economic policies of individual state governments also have to be looked at. One of the things which you have done is you have gone in for a loan waiver that affects millions of farmers in the country. Now, I asked the chief economist, Geeta Gopinath of the IMF, about that. And she said that it's problematic. She said, India has serious stress in the agricultural sector. It should not take the form of loan waivers. Are you doing your bit for the Indian economy, or are you doing your bit for your state?
Well, the agricultural sector in India, and particularly in my state, has been in distress. And when you look at numbers, you'll talk about 7.5% GDP. What does this 7.5% translate into? Does it translate into jobs? Does it translate into domestic investment and foreign investment? The GDP is a fancy figure. I've dealt with it for a long time as Commerce Minister. And sometimes it can be very misleading. But coming back to your point of loan waiver, 70% of the people in my state, which has 75 million people, are directly or indirectly connected with agriculture. So a farmer is born in debt and he dies in debt. So when you waive off a loan, you are in fact infusing that money into the state economy. There are different ways you can look at loan waiver. You can say it's bad banking practice. In any case, out of all the loans, 50 or 60% are NPAs. They're going to happen. They just roll them over. So you got to really hold the bull by the horns and say that now I want this sector to revive. Because if you don't revive this sector, which is the backbone of the economy, and I say it's the backbone of a very major ingredient of India's economy, the agricultural sector. So I thought it was very necessary. It's one step. It's not the end. It's one step towards reviving the agricultural sector, which means 70% of people. A farmer, a tractor driver is not a farmer.
But how do you afford this? 35,000 crore rupees in your state alone. If you look at what the Congress, which has won several elections just in the last couple of weeks, it could come to between 65 and 70,000 crore rupees across India in various states put together. How do these states, and ultimately how does India afford this?
Well, where the state, it's not 35,000 crores to translate into dollars. It's about 55,000 crores, which we are waiving off. That amounts to about $8 billion we are waiving off.
Yes.
Simple. 80% are scheduled banks. And 50% of their loans are NPAs, but 60% are NPAs in any case. So what we've done is we've taken over these loans and asked the banks for a one-time settlement. Now, they've done this for the industry. And the banks have taken a haircut of 40 to 50%. So if they've taken a haircut for industry of 40 to 50%, then why not for farmers? So the state government has taken over the loans of all the scheduled banks. Then there are the various cooperative banks for state government. That's easy to deal with. But at the end of the day, when I talk to the banks are clear that yes, we need to make these into current loans,
Yes.
not NPAs. Because if it remains an NPA, it's going to hit their balance sheet.
Yes.
It's going to hit their balance sheet and they won't know how to deal with it.
Yep.
So it's in the bank's interest also that I do it. But coming back to your point about China and United States trade war, I think the bigger signal in that is the collapse or heading towards the collapse of the world trading order and the rule-based trading order which the world had. Now, does this signal that? Is the United States which led the WTO? As Commerce Minister for many, many years, the United States used to say we are the leaders of free market. And everybody knows that. They said we are the ones who established the global trading order. And now they are leading the world in making the global trading order collapse. So
it's not just a good deal that they're seeking. They're seeking to change the status quo.
Absolutely. It's not just China and the United States. What about United States and Europe? What about United States and Canada? What about United States and Mexico? What about United States and India? Now there's some fingers being pointed at India, thinking, perhaps the leadership thinks that the US economy can be revved up by this.
Yeah.
But the world has changed.
Yeah.
And the world has changed, some of the people haven't.
Yeah. I just want to go across to Mr. Sandleris. We'll talk about Argentina in a moment, but would you like to actually come in with more on what Mr. Kamalnath was referring to? That what we are looking at today, the context of this discussion, US protectionist tendencies, aggressive trade strategies vis-a-vis several countries, is part of a strategy to change the status quo. It's no longer as free as it once was. Assuming what I'm asking is correct, how does that impact Argentina and Latin American countries?
I think that there are two dimensions. First is the trade wars you mentioned. The second one is the normalization in interest rate that we are observing in developed economies. I think that emerging markets in general are much better prepared to cope with this more challenging environment than what they were in the past. I'm going to focus on Latin America specifically, and we see that, for example, the current account that used to, in the 90s, for example, show a large deficit for most countries. Now it's balanced or close to balance. Inflation, which used to be around 120% on average for Latin American economies in the 90s, has come down to one-digit figure for most countries. The fiscal stance is much more solid. However, Argentina had a difficult year last year, in 2018, mostly because it was not prepared to cope with this new environment. Argentina still had a large fiscal deficit, a large current account deficit. And I think that what has changed significantly after the large depreciation we had of the currency last year and the contraction in economic activity is that now Argentina is prepared. The current account deficit, which was close to 5% last year, is going to be this year around 1.5% of GDP. The fiscal deficit, which a couple of years ago was 5% of GDP, in 2019 is going to show a balanced budget. We still have as something very important to correct inflation. Inflation remains very high. As a result of the depreciation last year, Argentina had inflation in the upper 40s, and that's the big challenge that we faced at the central bank now, to lower that inflation.
And I meant to ask you, the IMF loan, $57.1 billion, the austerity drive that has followed in its wake, there's been an element of public resentment as well, of a sense that somebody outside is running, in a sense, the Argentinian economy. How critical and how difficult has it been for your country and your political leadership to deal with public sentiment at a time when the economy has suffered?
First, a correction. The program we are implementing is the Argentine government program. It's not the IMF program. I think that there was some frustration last year associated with the very difficult economic conditions that the country faced. Remember that Argentina was expected to grow by around 3% in 2018, and it ended up contracting by around 2%. Inflation, which was expected to be in the 20s, ended up being twice or more than twice higher than that. So I think that the frustration is associated with a very difficult year that the Argentine people had. And I think that in this case, the IMF is part of the solution because it guarantees the funding that Argentina needs, so it's not so vulnerable to this new world environment, because Argentina doesn't need to go to the capital markets now to borrow, neither last year nor this year or the next one. So that gives a more solid stance for Argentina.
Sure. And just looking at other Latin American countries, emerging economies, in the context of 2019, in the context of the scenario we find ourselves now in, how do you project growth in Latin America?
Latin America is expected to grow this year. The largest country, Brazil, is expected to show a healthy growth rate of around 2% this year. Mexico is expected to grow again. And I would say that Argentina, which declined last year by around 2%, is expected to at least achieve moderate growth or a mild decrease in output. So I think that the perspective for Latin America this year are much better.
Yeah. Tariq Sultan Al-Essa, we had a fantastic conversation yesterday where you were telling me about some of the technology that Agility, your company, is actually looking at in terms of working with small and medium enterprises, something that's not happened. You are the only one on this panel who's not a policymaker per se. You approach this panel from as a business leader. Is it your sense that, you know, it's all very well to talk at a macro level about China and the United States and emerging economies, but at the lower level, there is plenty of opportunity, despite these concerns, of doing business?
I think that's absolutely correct. If you look at this issue of China and the U.S., for example, I think both of those countries, China is still growing at 6.5%. The U.S. grew at 4%, I think, the last quarter. So, I mean, obviously their economies are still growing and very healthy. But I think we need to look at this from the context of SMEs and look at it from the perspective of what we know today. And it's very clear if you look at the emerging markets, the growth rates, the growth profile there is superior than the developed markets, perhaps double. But I think we need to, the big problem with this dispute is we're not focusing on what's, I think, important to actually address growth, and that is focusing on the things that matter to SMEs. And in particular, we need to look at what's holding SMEs back, and that's basically we need to take the measures in our economies that simplify and facilitate the business environment so SMEs can be more participative in the global economy.
Yeah. You were also telling me that in terms of your own industry, your own company, when you come across what a lot of people would say is an exaggeration, that, you know, the emerging economies are suffering, we don't know what's going to happen next. Your answer to that is you look at it from a 10, 15-year perspective. In fact, perhaps even a 20-year perspective, that you will ride out the storm. There may not be a fundamental change in the order that we now see, and therefore there is plenty of business to be done.
That's for sure. If you're a bank or a financial institution and you're looking at these I would say, trade fluctuations, you can maybe do things that can change a decision on a dime. But if you're investing in warehousing and infrastructure on the ground to enable, and technology to enable SMEs, those are decisions that you're making for a 10, 20-year investment horizon. And I think if you look at the facts, you look at the growth profiles, you know, there's some challenges in the emerging markets for sure, but if you pick wisely, and even, I mean, we know, for example, Turkey has had some issues, but if you look at the balance of all emerging markets and you look at it from a portfolio perspective, you're still getting superior growth return and profile for your investors and also for SMEs.
Yeah. Kevin, you know, we are here talking about the economy at a very broad level. But I don't know if you've had a chance to look at the World Economic Forum's risk report, which has come out. For the first time ever, the immediate impact in terms of risk and a long-term impact is related to the environment. It's related to climate change. As we talk about growth, there is one factor which affects billions across the world. It's having an environment which is sustainable. It's not just sustainable growth sans looking at the environment. How are these factors also critical and something that needs to be measured and taken into account as we talk about emerging economies and their futures?
Well, remember, part of the dispute that's taking place is how to offset the environmental factors and saying how quickly, for example, Paris Climate Accords, should emerging markets be allowed to pollute the planet when they start from a very different base in terms of their economic development. Indeed, that was one of the original issues that the Trump administration and the Chinese administration disagree on. And so as a result, it's fundamental. Clearly, we are now in a place where there is a consensus around the need to think very hard at a number of factors. Different governments take different views, including the United States, about the true impact on the environment. But this is now very much a part of every dialogue. And frankly, when you talk to the investment community and you understand how they see corporates, they're expecting them now to be very thoughtful about what they're doing in terms of the environment, but also in terms of a whole range of social goals. And one of the realities of the discussion we're having here at Davos is we can, in this very beautiful resort, have an isolated discussion about how wonderful business is doing, but that's of no value if it doesn't take into account how society is seeing business. And one of the issues business has to tackle is pollution, another is inequality, and the list is getting longer, education and the impact of automation and reskilling. Yeah. So the notion that the business community can somehow or other externalize all these factors and ignore them, gone. The business of business is no longer just business. Yeah. It has to take into account the broader context. And I feel from the conversations that we're having, people get that. Yeah. The WEF report highlights it. And frankly, the whole subject that we're discussing, Globalization 4.0, puts that at the center of the conversation.
Yeah. You had a point to make. Yeah,
yes.
Go ahead.
I just want to add a further dimension. In the last 30 minutes or so, we touched on economic growth in terms of open free trade and sustainability, environmental protection. A further dimension is inclusiveness.
Yes,
absolutely.
If economic growth, especially in the emerging economies, do not meet this requirement of inclusiveness, we may end up with some of the problems that the mature economies are now facing. That is, people are very aggrieved. There is unequal distribution of resources. Young people do not have enough opportunities.
Yep.
So some very strange things will happen when you turn to the people for a decision if they are so unhappy, as we have seen from some election results and also some referendum.
Yeah.
So it is extremely important for us to bear in mind at the outset of growing the economy that inclusiveness. And that is one reason why in the case of Hong Kong, we are a small economy. Our public sector accounts for only 20% of our GDP, but we spend 60% of that 20% of our GDP on social services.
Yeah. It's interesting what you're mentioning, and what I was actually trying to dig up is Oxfam's report, the Global Inequality Report, which came out just a couple of days back. And as we talk about our economies, emerging economies, here's a reality check which we should never forget. The wealth of the world's 1,900 billionaires increased by $900 billion in the last year alone, or $2.5 billion a day. Meanwhile, the wealth of the poorest half of humanity, or 3.8 billion people, fell by 11%. Just one more example, just to put this all in context for us. The world's richest man, Jeff Bezos, and I'm quoting from the report, the owner of Amazon, saw his fortune increase to $112 billion. Just 1% of his fortune is the equivalent to the entire health budget for Ethiopia, a country of 115 million people. That's what we are ultimately talking about. Is that something that concerns you, that as we talk about large-scale economic growth, we are forgetting about how unequal the system sometimes is? Yes.
Okay. That's a very meaningful question. Why? Because we are talking this on behalf of big unpredictabilities and uncertainties approaching ahead of us. I think nobody knows what's going to happen at 2020, and what is very much problematic. And I think everybody is discussing what has happened in 2008. There was this global crisis, but there is this optimism on the table. Why? Because the whole economies reacted all together and aligned and coordinated. Right now, there is a big concern what's going to happen if there is this potential problematic economical problems ahead of us. The thing is, out of this big box, what you mentioned about is a humanitarian perspective is very crucial. And I do think that those kind of leading economies should play some significant role how we can improve the world needs and use every single person living on this planet, how we can improve that. But out of this, what Kerry mentioned or Kevin mentioned just recently, in case of this free trade issues, that's simple because Turkey is one of the leading supporters of this free trade issue because this is how it used to be in the previous century. But when we reached this new century, it's something else. It has started. All the reactions, not only specific leadership, but what is very much crucial over here is, other than United States, we are heading to a different era in the European hinterland as well. Everybody is questioning what's going to happen for the coming year in UK, Germany, or France, and how we are going to manage this for the sake of the humanity, global economy, what else. But as a real optimist of the emerging market point of view, including Turkey as well, we have some additional strategic implementational methods on the ground, which already started after switching to this new system. Because this new system, some of the people, least people knows about it, created a very strong boost for Turkey's reaction to potential threats or challenges the ground. This is why we have reacted very strongly in the last 4 or 5 months. And this is what we promised so far in the new economical program we have announced in September. And as a result of this, we have achieved all of it. Because when we first arrived to the government arrived to the seat in July, there are 2 big concerns on the ground. Like, will Turkey will continue to implement their budget discipline as well? Or the fighting inflation issue, it used to be a big one. But recently, because what has happened in Turkey, it's a not normal one that you get used to see every single day in the global arena. 2 years ago, almost 2.5 years ago, what we have witnessed so far in this July 15 coup attempt. Not only Turkish history, by the way, including Ottoman times in that region, first time ever. Hundreds of people died, thousands of them wounded, millions of them were on the street to defend their democracy and future. We ended up prioritizing economy 3-4.
Right. Obviously, I mean, the strategies which you've looked at and the challenges which you face are absolutely incredible, particularly in the time period that you referred to. But Mr. Kamalnath, if we are looking at sustainable economic growth, the importance of the environment, which has been projected over here at WEF so many times this year alone, in India, there are now numbers that say 1 in 8 people die as a result of air pollution. These are statistics which emerge. Why is it not a political issue in the world's largest democracy?
It is a political issue. To say it's not a political issue, I think will not be fair. Pollution is a big problem in India. And India, I think, is one of the countries which is addressing it. Now with new technologies, you have to jump many queues to adopt to adapt and adopt yourself to these new technologies, whether they are energy or whatever. So India is addressing it. But I want to get back to this point of inequality.
Yes.
This subject of survival of the fittest versus the revival of the weakest, and has been debated here in Davos many times, and I've participated and read of them. And what is distributive justice? Where does distributive justice start from? Does it start from government? Does it start from industry? Does it start from government policy? And when we talk of distributive justice, you just read out figures from Oxfam, and they are indeed distressing.
Yes.
They are very distressing. We must look at a much broader picture. When I was talking of farmers, if we want this disparity to go, you got to see agriculture, where many of the countries are agriculturally not dependent, but heavy on agriculture. You see huge subsidies. You see huge subsidies by the developed countries. For example, the United States has agricultural subsidies of $63 billion. And if you look at the US Farm Bureau figures and see what are their subsidies. Now, how does the Indian farmer compete with the US Treasury? He's not competing with the US farmer. He's competing with the US Treasury. That's where this disparity starts. So we got to look at distributive justice in a new way. You know, we must recognize here in Davos this time that there is the new global order is the global disorder. It really is a disorder not merely in trade. Look at all parts of the world. There is a global disorder. Southeast Asian countries are insular, have not felt this so much. And if you look at the global disorder in all facets, whether it's the economy, whether it's politics, whether in so many of these things, you cannot address this issue of disparity in isolation.
Right.
It has to be looked at in totality. And nobody talks of it in totality. Everybody talks of his own domain, his own domain as a subject, that this is what we can do. But I think this has to be looked at holistically.
Yeah.
And unless we do that, this disparity is only going to increase.
Yeah, it is increasing. It's statistically increasing.
And, there's no one size fits all. Again, when you talk of so many things, there's no one size fits all. You have countries which demographically are very strong. So when you talk of markets, markets are going to be dictated not merely by monetary policy, not merely by protectionism, but by demographics.
Sure.
And for countries which have a very, like India, with the largest aspirational society on this planet, market means something else. The market dictates will be very different.
Sure.
India has gone through the 2008 collapse,
Yes.
largely untouched.
Yes.
And so India, to put it, I think, accurately, India grows despite everything.
Thus far, it has a lot to do this year, according to the oil prices coming down as well, commodity prices as well. I'd like to open up the panel at this stage. We've got about 20 minutes or so left to questions. If you can raise your hands, we can bring a couple of questions on board. A show of hands, please. Yes, sir, in the back. If you can identify yourself and ask your question.
Very much. Actually, my question is for the youngest man in the panel, young-hearted, come on now. Just following what you just said, PricewaterhouseCoopers report about prediction what's going to happen in 2050 puts India as the second biggest economy in the world after China, ahead of United States. Talking about these inequalities and everything else that's going around us with Oxfam reports and everything else, how do you, in your position, ensure or assure that there will be, by then, it'll be more equitable distribution of wealth in that country? Because today we have 35 or 45 families own substantial amount of the billionaires in the country today of the wealth of India. How do you assure that's going to be not the case by 2050?
Well, the first thing is that PwC has, I think, amongst the many things they get right, this is what they've got right. I was not going to say amongst few things. I said amongst the many things they get right, this is one of the few things. India is heading towards the second largest economy. Now, what does that mean? How does that happen? Does it happen by natural resources? Does it happen by global policy? Does it happen by internal policy? I think a country has to inherently have two things. Has to have the intellectual ability and the entrepreneurial skills to be able to reach there. India has both of them. And as I said when I was speaking the last time, that India grows despite all government policy, despite global effects. That's what India does. And I think the thinking in India today, India 30 years ago, 40 years ago, we considered ourselves that we will trudge along. Today, India is not the same India. You have a young generation. You have a young generation which is tremendously aspirational. You have a young generation which is educated. And
also unemployed.
Also unemployed. And they are looking, that's what is there.
That's the biggest problem.
One of the biggest political challenges will be to meet that, to meet the challenges of unemployment, skilled unemployment, and also unskilled unemployment. That is priority. Agriculture is one, and unemployment is the other. That this huge numbers we got of unemployed youth,
yes,
they are going to be the driving force of government policy.
Sure.
They are going to be the driving force of the private sector.
Yeah. Tariq had a point, and then I'll come to you next. Yes, go ahead.
So I think it's very difficult to talk about inclusiveness without talking about the complexity and how complexity impacts different sectors of the economy. If you look I think large businesses, if you're trying to answer the question, I think in a really helpful way, I think large businesses can navigate complexity. And it's the SMEs that are disproportionately impacted by that complexity. So I think the way you ensure that this growth and this growth dividend is inclusive is by basically improving the business environment and making sure that the playing field is level. And I think if we're able to focus from the lens of a small and medium-sized enterprise, I think you get to where you want to go.
Sure. You had a point before I
Well, I think
bring in more questions. Yes.
I'm Scottish, so I'm institutionally brought up to see the negative in everything, and I think we're doing a good job of that. Because at one level, one of the things we've forgotten is the world also saw 700 million people out of poverty, and that is a huge step.
Yes.
The problem we've got is this: what is it actually going to take to allow 1 million people a month, I think it is in India, to find employment as they come into the workforce? What is it going to take, on the other hand, in a China where actually the demographics are going in the other direction and where the workforce is reducing? And let's remember this. This is all going to happen in an era when automation means that the nature of work is going to change. And the issue for the emerging markets, I think, comes to a rub, which is this, which is the world no longer needs low-cost labour in the way it did before. So the model that got us here is not going to be the model that gets us out of the situation we're in. Less than 20% of goods now are really located in manufacturing terms because of labour arbitrage. We're moving to a society which is automated, knowledge intensive. I hope that the solution we're going to take reflects how do we use technology as a positive? How do we make the emerging markets knowledge-led, an employment model that doesn't lead to everything being closed down, because the answer is not going to be less global trade, it's more trade, it's more opportunities. That's the challenge we've got. And there is a danger, as we all give our favourite negative statistic, that we don't see that big picture. The problem we have now is how do we redefine global trade so it does deliver, not how do we stop it?
You raised some important points, and Mr. Sandler, again, at this session of the WEF, they've focused a great deal on new technologies. They've looked at artificial intelligence. They've looked at drone technology and how our lives are going to fundamentally change. The question is, how is this likely to impact employment in the future? And how does technology versus employment become a real problem?
I think it's a very important question. But I want to second what Kevin was saying. And I think it's key not to forget in this process of autoflagellation, because we haven't solved all the problems, that capitalism has been a fantastic force to lift people out of poverty in the last decades. And free trade was a crucial piece in this system. And it should remain so. Argentina is a country that embraces free trade. And we shouldn't forget, in these more challenging times when the world order is being redefined, that free trade should keep on playing a very central role. But of course, more should be done. Inclusiveness of growth is crucial to get support for the process that we are seeing. And going to your point, you know that last year Argentina held the presidency of the G20, and the future of work was one of the two topics that Argentina chose as the key topics to discuss in the G20. And I would say there that one of the things that for me is key is we have to be aware of ludismo again, okay? Artificial intelligence or automation is not a problem, it's just a challenge that we face. We need to find ways to educate people to be able to find work in new positions that are going to open up as a result of this process.
Further questions? Yes, sir. The gentleman right in the right. There'll be a microphone which comes across to you.
Hi, my name is Gilberto Marin from Mexico, and I would like to ask to the panel, especially to Guido, and there are some other comments about what are the expectations, the challenges, and opportunities, especially in Brazil, Mexico, and Argentina.
Well, I think that...
Yes, absolutely.
So I think that these are challenging times for different reasons for the three large countries in Latin America. Big challenge coming from this redefinition of the world order associated with these incipient trade wars. A second challenge is this era of liquidity that we have observed in the last decades is coming to an end. And that poses significant challenges for the three countries. In Brazil, we have a new administration that just came in that is trying to implement significant reforms to put Brazil back in the road to growth. Something similar happened in Argentina at the end of 2015 with this administration of President Macri that had to undo decades of wrong economic policies. And I think that Mexico is facing significant challenges also associated with the new administration that is trying to bring some new ideas to the field.
Yes, ma'am. The mic will come across to you.
Hi, good morning. My name is Mariam McIntosh Robinson. I'm from Jamaica. I run a bank in Jamaica. And my question for the panelists, I think someone mentioned that as we strive for this inclusive growth, when we think about emerging economies, there's some that are more emerging, and then there are small economies that are less emerging. And so what role do you guys see the world playing in ensuring that the small, less emerging economies are not left behind? So that's question number one. And just additional context, I do have a fear that as we move into the fourth industrial revolution and that there is more innovation taking place in a fast pace, there's no one body that's really regulating how this happens and ensures that these smaller countries are not left behind. So how do you see that playing out for emerging, emerging markets?
Would you like to take that question, the small versus the big within the emerging economies, how some countries should not be left behind?
Well, I can competently only talk about this Asian region. Within the Asian region, on the one hand, it is the driving force for economic growth. But at the same time, we do have several emerging economies of different scales and at different levels of development. So, of course, many of you have heard about this Belt and Road Initiative of the mainland of China. The very spirit and intention is really to raise connectivity, to put in infrastructure, so that there will be mutual benefits, especially to the emerging economies. And Hong Kong's role within this bigger picture is because we are pretty mature, and over the years we have established very good systems. I have put in place a program of what we call capacity building. So in the last year or so, we have been reaching out to some of the emerging economies in the Asian region, like Myanmar, like Vietnam, and to assist them in several aspects. One is capacity building in terms of institutional safeguards. So anti-corruption and rule of law and things like that. Because if you want to attract investment, investors will look for those safeguards. The other is, of course, in physical management of a city, in terms of law and order, flood prevention, slope stabilization, in order so that we are in a better position, the emerging economies will be in a better position to confront natural disasters and things like that.
But you spoke about the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a huge initiative by China. But it's confronted by concerns. For example, India, we share a long contested boundary between the two sides. We consider the Belt and Road Initiative to be a serious concern to our sovereignty. So when you're confronted by these realities, sovereignty versus what some believe to be the way forward for economic growth, what's the way out?
Now, the Belt and Road Initiative announced by President Xi Jinping is reaching its 6th anniversary. If one reads carefully into the speeches made by President Xi, the focus is really on international cooperation. And that was the theme of the very important International Cooperation Summit held 2 years ago, and it's going to host a second one this April. So I think the theme is really on international cooperation. But about these worries of some of these countries along the Belt and Road about sovereignty, that requires constructive dialogue to resolve some of those problems.
I couldn't agree more. Further questions? Yes, sir.
My question is for Mr. Albayrak. I'm Pawan Goenka from Mahindra & Mahindra, and we have meaningful investment in Turkey. As you know, that last couple of years have been very difficult for businesses in Turkey because of exchange rate, inflation, interest rate, even labor cost going up. But you have given a very positive, optimistic scenario for Turkey going forward. So very straight question. Is it time for foreign investors to double down in Turkey or stay put?
Well, I didn't get the last one.
Is it time for foreign investors like us to double down on Turkey or shall we stay put?
I mean, you know the answer, I think.
But you have to tell me why, not just
why. Yeah, that's very much important. This is why I was just trying to come over there, but this is the chance. Let me finish that phrase that I was just trying to say over here, especially about Turkey. You know, what is very much important? I think the confidence and credibility has been very much affected in the last couple of years in Turkey, as I have mentioned, all the crisis problems, internal, regional, whatsoever. Again, what I have mentioned, underlined that within this new system, we approach to a new era. And this new era have almost three big challenges, traditional challenges for not only emerging economies, but Turkey itself. What are they? Budget discipline is one of it, fighting inflation problem, and the current account deficit problem for all of it. But since from the first day of the beginning of our economical announcement, new economical program, we said we're going to deliver this till the year end. And for the 3 years of MTP or new economical program stuff, we're going to deliver this within this aspects. And we ended up a very strong delivery result to boost the confidence.
But answer this question. Does he stay on in Turkey to do business, or does he look at alternatives?
Okay,
He's worried about that.
Okay, I'm coming there. The thing is, what Turkey achieved so far till that moment and from now on, and especially the things that we're talking about, all these kind of threats, let me add that phrase as well. Turkey have some unique advantages on that sense as well. Three main pillars are crucial on Turkish economy, including Belt and Road, including inclusiveness, including competitive private whatsoever. Because that's a good phrase. Maybe some see as a threat, some see as an opportunity, but I do see as an opportunity. Why? Because that's a big shift comparing to 500 years ago, exploring United States, this Silk and Spice Road strategy from all around to Asia, to Europe. This is, again, reestablishing this mindset with an inclusiveness perspective. Spice Road coming from India, Silk Road coming from China, all the way from through Asia to Europe, combines and unites the economies and inclusiveness perspective. This is something very much crucial for Turkish economy and Turkey, where Turkey is as well. Three main pillars are crucial in that sense. Why? Because Turkey has a very young, dynamic, and very volunteer perspective, educated young workforce. Comparing to 2002 till now, Turkish government hugely invested on and ranked the #1 Ministry of Education, which they take the highest portion of the cake, which used to be Ministry of Defense. 16 consecutive years, which we ended up not only a young workforce, but a very competitive, aggressive, mid-young class, very highly adapted to any specific challenges. Second, we have a very competitive private sector, exporting more than 20,000 units of different products to all around the world, which we have increased the capacity of export from $35 billion to $107 billion within that sense. And what is very much crucial about Turkey is, last 16 years, we have invested hugely on infrastructure, which are transportation, telecommunication, and energy, which I a little bit know about it because I used to be the energy minister. Not only we have completed our internal needs, but the regional perspective-wise, we have completed railways, highways, airports, infrastructure, LNGs, FSRUs, international pipelines, whatsoever, plus the telecommunication structural cables whatsoever. So, which we ended up, very strong balance sheet, even challenging times.
So bottom line is that you are stable and you want to bring in investors. I think that's the key point. I'm interrupting because we've just got 6 minutes left.
Okay.
I think that's the essential answer to what you are asking.
Maybe one word, one
absolutely.
sentence about it. So all in all, if we accumulated all of it, these three threats, we have curbed them all. Inflation part of it, budget discipline part of it, why we have delivered, and fighting with this current account deficit better than what we have announced so far, and it's running well. By the way, I have just told my Minister of Trade right now, January results is promising as well. Export is increasing, import is decreasing, so current account part of it. Thank you.
I will just try and see any further shows of I've got you, sir, just 1 second. The gentleman in the back, and I'll come to you after that. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. A question for Mr. Nat and maybe Ms. Lam. I'm Xavier Cogé from the European Commission. Mr. Nat, you said rightly so that the US are now challenging the open rules-based world order. European Union, we have proposed to China, US, Japan to reform the WTO to save it, and notably to upgrade the rules on subsidies, because subsidies from China have created distortions that are a real problem. Do you think we can do it? Would India support that? Would China come on board, Ms. Lam? And can the whole world community tone down their request on WTO? Because for the past 15 years, we have never been able
so
to...
So you're asking about upgrading rules on subsidies and whether India and China would actually... Mr. Nath, would you like to comment on that?
Well, it's very essential that the rule-based trading system remains intact. Of course, there will be ups and downs. There'll be some speed breakers to cross. But challenging the whole rule-based trading system of the world can be fatal. And we are going to move from a multilateral agreement and multilateral rules to bilateral. There was a time when bilateral trade agreements were considered to be an aberration to the multilateral system. Now, you see more and more countries. Yesterday, one of the ministers was telling me that he's looking at bilateral trade agreements with several countries. Mm-hmm. That means, is it being taken for granted that the multilateral system has collapsed? Over the years, the rule-based trading system also has to adopt itself to the changes which are taking place, to artificial intelligence, to cyber. These were never issues 10 years ago. To so many new things which are happening. New technologies have brought to the fore new markets. E-commerce. Who would have thought 20 years ago, 15 years ago, that e-commerce would become one of the most contentious issues in the global trading order?
Right.
Today, it is a contentious issue. So I would say, to answer that, India would fully support a rule-based trading system. Yeah. And we have supported it. We will continue to support it. Yeah. But we must understand that free trade also means fair trade. And fair trade cannot be packed with subsidies, cannot be packed with unfair subsidies and unfair, something like tariff barriers.
Sure.
Many of the free flow of trade is stopped because of strange non-tariff barriers.
Okay.
This is what happens.
Okay. Yes, sir, you had a quick question before. We've got about 3 minutes left. Quick question, sir, and then we'll take one more after that.
I am Ashok Bandwal from India. My question is, in the 20th century, we had a Cold War between the two factions. That was based on the military power. 21st century, we see another Cold War coming up. That time, there was a non-aligned movement. Now, are the panelists looking towards another non-aligned kind of movement in terms of trade and not in terms of military power or political power?
Who would like to answer that question? Yes.
Well, the reality is that the nature of trade has shifted. And if you actually look at where that trade is, it's fundamentally shifted. It used to be north-north, the developed world to the developed world. Part of what we've got now is it's not. It's south-south. That's the fastest growing axis of trade. So the nature of trade has shifted. It used to be physical goods. Actually, it's services. We haven't talked about that, but it's largely services. That's what's driving the growth. Half the counterparties are in these markets. They're in the emerging markets. So we are dealing with a change in the nature of globalization and in the nature of trade. And just to quote Dickens, who I think got it right, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. The best of times, actually the global economy is doing just fine. We can talk it down, but it's doing just fine. It was the worst of times because the old order hasn't quite worked in terms of making that global trade work in the interests of everyone, and the inequalities are a fundamental issue. Best of times, worst of times, I guess you can decide which side we should all be on, but I really hope we don't realize that the whole thing isn't working. We've got to find a way to make this change and this fundamental shift work. And if we do that, actually, technology can work in our favor.
One final question. Anybody? Yes, sir.
There was talk today of...
So could you identify yourself?
I'm Ajay, I'm from India. And my question is on this inequality. Do you think it is time to put a tax on net worth of individuals and the corporates, and reduce income tax for individuals and reduce the corporate tax? Is it time to change how taxation revenues are generated in emerging economies and other economies?
Who would like to take that question? Mr.
President,
Sanders, you look at
President
me.
Trump will answer that.
So Argentina passed last year a tax reform along these lines. Argentina had a very high corporate income tax, and it decreased it because it had to follow, in a sense, the line of what many countries in the region and in the world were doing. Sometimes companies are very movable, so they can shift their business from one country to another if the income tax is very high. So I think there is a trend along these lines that we are seeing in many countries in the world.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank all of you for being with us. It's been a wonderful conversation with our panelists. And as we leave this, I think the big points that we are looking at over here in terms of emerging economies is that, yes, there are concerns, yes, there are threats, yes, there is the US factor in all of this, but the larger issue is something that needs to be looked at from a longer term perspective. And I think a lot of the points mentioned, and indeed the entire argument about global inequality, is something that needs to be looked at very, very closely. Thanks very much for being with us.